Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Leon Tabak, and I will be the moderator for this program. We are going to respond to an article that appeared recently in The Atlantic magazine. The article is titled, "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" The author is Jean Twenge. She is a professor of psychology at San Diego State University. The article in the September issue of The Atlantic is a condensation of a book that's just appeared. It's called iGen, Why Today's Super-Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. To help us explore this topic, we have three guests. Don Damsteegt is with Family Psychology Associates here in Cedar Rapids.
Yes.
Okay. And Taylor Axelson is a student, a junior, at Cornell College. I'll come back to you in just a moment so you can say a little bit about yourself. And Juan Pablo Hourcade is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Iowa. So why don't you begin a little bit by telling us something about yourselves. Tell us about your work at Family Psychology Associates and perhaps something about your interest in this topic, Don.
Okay, well, I've been at Family Psychology Associates since 1994, and it's a group practice. We see a lot of kids there, and in preparation for this show tonight, or well, this morning, I asked some of the counselors there about what their experiences were with kids, and so I'll be talking about that a little bit.
And you're working with parents and children together sometimes, or at least you and your associates?
Yes, sometimes, although a lot of times kids are seen alone also.
Okay. And Juan Pablo, we're interested in you because of the way you use technology to help people. So there's a kind of, you're out of the purely technological realm and into the social realm with some of your work. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so my research is in a field called human-computer interaction. So we not only design technologies, but we look at their impact on society. My research in particular is about designing technologies for people who are not the focus of most Silicon Valley companies. So for example, children diagnosed with autism, older adults with specific conditions, people with motor impairments. But I also generally have an interest in how technologies are affecting society and in particular children.
And are there others at the university who are doing related work? Or there's a larger community of people doing this in computer
There
science?
are a few others. There's two other professors in the computer science department in human-computer interaction who are doing research in that general area, and there's a couple of other faculty members in other departments as well.
Okay, Taylor, just a little bit about yourself. You're from Colorado. Tell us what you're studying.
Yeah, I'm a student athlete. I play volleyball. I'm studying data science and business analytics. I'm a junior.
Okay, tell our audience just very briefly what this analytics thing is here.
Analytics has a lot to do with statistics, so it's all about what do these numbers mean, and then what can we make of them, and how can we improve whatever we're working on based on those numbers.
Okay, so we have a psychologist. Our topic touches on technology, so we have a technologist. And we have a young person, so we're going to start with you. And I'd like to know a little bit of whatever you want to share about your upbringing, what you've seen with friends and classmates, sort of when you got your hands on these technologies, which of these various software services and applications are most popular with your peers. Tell us a little bit of what's going on there that us older folks might not see so clearly every day.
I got my first cell phone when I was going into the 6th grade.
Okay.
And back then it wasn't quite as much of a smartphone. It was very simple, just sending text, calling, but now it's developed into much more than that. And I think some of the most popular apps today are Snapchat, which is a picture sharing app, and some of my friends even prefer to use that as texting as their main form of communication.
Right.
And it's also, you can post things on there. Along with that is Instagram's very popular, and so sometimes when people are even out doing things not related to technology, they're like, hold on, let me take a picture, I have to have this on my Instagram. And one of the more popular ones that I think is less popular with my generation is Facebook. I think that could potentially be because people's moms, dads, grandmas, grandpas, or whatever are on Facebook, and they're not as willing to share all the different aspects of their life with everybody that they know, as opposed to like just their friend group or whatnot.
Okay, so our subject today is not just smartphones, though that appears in the title. Jean Twenge, as I say, is a psychologist whose special interest is following changes from generation to generation. And in this latest book, she's making a broader characterization about the generation born since 1995. And she put the smartphone in the title because she saw some trends accelerate at about the time that technology was introduced. So tell us a little bit about how this comes up in your practice. Have you seen patients with concerns about this? Don?
I asked counselors in our agency who work with kids a lot, that is, kids who are young teenagers, even preteens, and they immediately were very vocal about their concerns. One counselor said that she'd had 5 young people who had to be hospitalized for depression and suicide attempts within the past few months. And another counselor said 3 young people. That depression seems to be much more rampant in this generation of preteens and teens than it was in generations past. Interesting thing that one person said is there's a difference between cutters, that is, people who cut themselves because they really are full of emotional pain or want to die, and Facebook cutters who cut themselves and so they can post that on Facebook, and then other people can be concerned about them. So it's like an attention-seeking device.
You heard of this?
Not specifically,
Okay.
but
it makes sense to you
yeah.
from what you know going on.
And then another piece of that is that there's this contagion of distress, so that when a young person sees another person seeming depressed or having cut themselves, then everyone feels they need to leap in and try to help. And so then there's all kinds of support that comes, but people feel burdened by having to help all these other people who have all these problems. So it causes a lot of distress for people.
Okay. Juan, Pablo, I'd like your help in helping our audience understand how this technology differs from what you and I had when we were growing up. So maybe a little preface here. I think that a lot of the applications of computing technology began as simple imitations of older technology. So the first email programs were like a telegraph. The first word processor programs were like a typewriter. But today a word processing program can do much more than a typewriter. And a cell phone is something very different than the phone that was on the counter in my parents' home when I was growing up. So what do you think are some of the distinctive characteristics of these technologies that Taylor and her classmates are using?
Yeah, I think the companies that make smartphones and also researchers who worked on some of that technology beforehand have been very successful in making devices that are extremely easy to use. So you don't need to be any kind of genius to use a smartphone. And they're easy to carry with you, and they're always immediately accessible. So if you want to check your social media, you're always within a second of being able to do that, and that was not possible when we had regular old computers that you had to turn on, you had to put in a password. It just took longer. And I think the immediacy is one big change. The other thing that's happened is you have a lot of companies that are vying for your attention, and they've been getting very good at giving you something that you want every time you open the media, be it social media or other services. And it really becomes addictive. I think there's that fix that's always there for you 1 second away, and that's a tempting thing, and that's what's making use so widespread. And I would say it's not only among young people, but also their parents. So there might be situations where conversations might have been had at home, and now maybe sometimes it's the children who are using a device, but sometimes it might be the parents who are busy looking at something.
So I'd like help from any one of the three of you here in saying a little bit more about the other trends that we read about in Twenge's article. So you mentioned rising rates of depression and self-harm. Is there anything else that we want to highlight here? If not, we can move on to something else. But can we recall anything else about trends or characteristics of this generation? Social habits and so on?
I mean, I could mention something else that this kind of access to media gives you, in that it's very personalized. Perhaps we end up having less in common to talk about with the people who might be physically around us, because everyone has their own set of news or information that they get that's different from everyone else. And whereas before we might have all watched the news together or read the same newspaper and talked about the same topics, now we might find people in another state who maybe share exactly our same set of interests, but it might be a little harder to find those coincidences within our families or within our classmates.
Right, and one of the things in her article that I was struck with is that she talks about a 13-year-old girl that she's talking with, and the 13-year-old girl had begun to express some frustration because when she tried to talk to her friend about her feelings, her friend was on a phone texting to somebody else and just saying and so on, and not really listening. And so there was that kind of sense of isolation that she felt, even though she's face to face with another person. So that struck me as being very realistic, that people aren't looking at each other, aren't reading nonverbals on the face, aren't paying attention to what the other person's saying because they're preoccupied with what's in front of them on their phone.
I see that a lot. And I've even been on teams where we've made rules where you can only have your phone out for the first 5 minutes of dinner, text your mom back, do whatever you need to do, and then put it away so that we can make those connections without being distracted by our phones.
Yeah, I was curious about what kind of guidance you've gotten from parents, teachers, or coaches. People who've shown concern about the
my coaches definitely stepped in and said things like that in order to make our team stronger. And I remember when I first got my phone, my parents were like, if you're doing anything important, the phone's away. If you're doing homework, the phone's away. Around grandparents or anything, the phone's away. So that's always kind of stuck with me, and I've tried to be more conscious about not always being on my phone.
Well, we invite our best students to these shows. When you look at your peers, do you sometimes, you may not wish to do this for politeness, but is there sometimes a temptation to correct or chastise classmates who are?
Sometimes there's, especially with the Snapchat, the snap streaks, people get very obsessed with making sure they have a snap streak, which is a count of how many days you've Snapchatted this person in a row. And that's something that's very frustrating to me because people are so obsessed with making sure they keep it for long periods of time, and I'm more on the side of you should go a few days without your phone, go to a place without service, and not be so connected all the time.
Did you, I just lost the train of my thought there for a moment. The author also talks about young people delaying some milestones that previous generations of teenagers eagerly sought. So can you comment on that? Did that sound right to you when you looked at this?
She said things about young people not getting their driver's licenses soon, and I have friends that have not gotten their driver's license because they don't need to. They aren't going to hang out with their friends because they're staying home, being on their phone, texting their friends that way. And if they're not going out with their friends, they're not doing things. They don't need to make money, so they don't need to have a job. They don't need a car to drive to the job.
Right. Any others?
I wanted to say one other thing that one of the counselors in our agency had brought up, and that is that the nuances of language and emotion which people would show on their face or in how they say something is lost when we're just on their phone all the time. As an example, a counselor said the word really, R-E-A-L-L-Y. And if you just see that word, what does it mean? Well, it could mean something different if it's really or really. And we don't have that awareness of the complexity of communication and of emotion when people are not communicating face to face.
Do you use or do you advise your patients to use technology to monitor their activities or their moods? Is this something that comes up in the practice of psychology?
It's a coming thing where there are apps that you can get to track your moods or to track interventions. If you're having sleep difficulties, to track your sleep hours and when you're awake and so on. So I have not personally done that. I'm an old guy and I don't get into the technology as much. But yes, there is a coming movement toward using more technology.
Some people talk about the future is the smartphone will become what the tricorder was on Star Trek, right? It's not only a computer, it's a sensor, it's an instrument. This could be a means for a lot of good things.
Yes, and I think that's something to always remember is not, the problems are not necessarily related to smartphone use in general, but how the smartphone is being used. So there's many possible positive uses of these devices for health purposes, for communication purposes, for getting information. I mean, they can be useful in many ways. So I think a lot of it is a matter of how we use them. I think humans have demonstrated to be quite adaptable in many situations, and it might be something where we're learning how to best use them, and we might have to learn lessons over time. And the challenge we have right now is that it's all happening so quickly that we're having a little bit of difficulty reacting, and that's a challenge. One other thing I wanted to mention is, in spite of our intuitions and some of the data, most of the data linking smartphone use to some of the challenges that we mentioned earlier, especially depression, it's mostly correlational. So we know they're both happening at the same time.
Right.
We have only a tiny bit of evidence that one might be causing the other. I looked up the similar years, and the opioid epidemic is happening and spiking at exactly the same time. And there's people have been trying to explain the roots behind that. As far as I know, smartphones have not been mentioned as a possible cause. So there might be other societal challenges that are bringing about depression and despair and psychological issues that might be behind some of these trends. And the smartphones and social media might be adding an extra ingredient that might amplify some of those challenges.
So the introduction of the smartphone, roughly coincided with the development of YouTube and of powerful search engines. One of the distinctions between a smartphone and the kind of telephone with which I grew up is that it's something that's always with you, but it's also something that you can use in private. And with the internet now, it's not just the communication, it's the content of the internet as well. And I really wonder what the experience of young people is today with an essentially uncensored internet and immediately available anywhere. You can peek in private. As I was telling you at lunch the other day, Taylor, when I was a teenager, I called a girlfriend at high school. I had to use the phone. It was, my brothers were listening. My mom and dad were right there. There was just one phone. You wanted to talk on the phone, you had to go to where the phone was. There was no privacy. How do you think about those things? Do you worry about not only when people communicate, but what they're saying, what they're viewing?
I think that largely corresponds with the amount of cyberbullying that there is, because people can hide behind the screen. It's easier to say things over text or whatnot. If people have something that they want to talk about that they're kind of nervous about, they'll always go to the phone and do it that way rather than talking face to face, and that can get people in trouble sometimes.
So that's like being in a car. We shout at the other driver, thinking that the driver can't hear us because there's a glass window between the two of us. And when you're on a smartphone, you might communicate in a way you don't face to face.
Well, and strikes me too with what you're saying, when people are receiving a message, say a put down, a bullying kind of message, they're receiving it alone. And so they're not able to turn to the friend and rail at the sender and get reassurance. They just take it in and feel it more deeply. So there's a more of a impact from it.
Okay. What were your experiences when you were growing up there, Juan Pablo?
Nothing like, well, I was a teenager in the 80s, so very different. Yeah. So I guess they were a lot more similar to yours, right? So one phone, one computer.
Yeah, we were not flooded with information. I grew up on a farm, and so I was a teenager in the late 50s, early 60s, and we listened, to a radio out in the barn, and TV once in a while in the evening. But there was so much more privacy and so much more time just to read and think and imagine, and not constantly flooded with information.
About what you think of the sense that young people today might have about social exclusion, that they might be more aware of being part of the popular group, not being part of the popular group. Jean Twenge talks about, it describes an experience that I can recall. You went to school on Monday morning, and you go to your locker, you might hear some other students halfway down the hall talking about their weekend activities, but it just sort of passed by. It wasn't in your face all the time. Now students like Taylor open up their phones and they see what their classmates were doing last night, the night before, the day before that, and it's inescapable.
And it's amplified, right? So
Right.
everyone finds out something embarrassing happens to you. It's not just the people who are there who see it. Everyone finds out right away. There might be a video of it. So it's a lot of, in some ways, if things are going well for you, maybe the positive gets amplified. But most people are not living perfect lives out there. So.
Right, and another example of that amplification was one of the counselors talked about a boy who, on a dare, kissed another boy, and somebody took a picture, and then forever after, he couldn't get away from that picture, and was used to shame him and so on. Your deeds are captured forever on the internet then, and you can't get away from them.
So stay away from the really salacious stuff at Cornell College there, Taylor. But have you seen some of your peers engage in acts that you think are cruel? Was that?
Not too much. It's
Okay.
more kind of
Well,
the
that's good
opposite.
news.
People
Yeah.
are taking pictures and posting things on social media more to, I don't want to say brag, but to show off what they're doing, to
Okay.
kind of be like, look, I'm doing this.
Okay. So it hasn't been as awful as some of these printed reports say. Okay, at least not for you. Okay, compare the worries now about smartphones with maybe an earlier generation worried about our time in front of the television. How does this experience differ, or how is it the same? What do you think?
I think there are often a lot of fears about new technologies coming in and how society will react. I could even go back to 19th century in British novels, and people were concerned that all of a sudden some people would go off and read for hours nonstop instead of talking to other people.
Right.
And with television, we had a lot of the early studies pointed at very negative outcomes for children. With more recent studies that have been much larger, we've learned that it really depends on a lot of factors. And if you take out a lot of other risks that might predict children ending up in trouble, then it doesn't have an effect.
Okay.
So I wonder if we might find some similar things once parents start to know best practices for smartphone use among young children. It might be that we learn to better steer them, and it might be those children who are in more challenging environments who may not get that and might be more at risk.
One of the things that Jean Twenge talked about was limiting cell phone use, and that parents do need to monitor them. Parents will allow their child to have the phone in their room, for example, and so the child could be on it for hours in the middle of the night, and parents aren't aware. And she cited some statistics that said if you have more than, I believe, 2 hours a day on your phone, that's highly correlated with more negative mood. And so, probably one thing that is going to evolve is some kind of best practices, as you said, for use of media, and how we need to limit it sometimes.
You ever think, Taylor, that the parents are complaining, but they're part of the same problem. They're also connected 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, when I started my career, we took turns taking a beeper home. You know, I worked for a software company, and there was one night a week we all had to be ready to fix the emergency bug or something. But in general, the workday ended and you went home and you had the evening or your weekend to yourself. Today we're all connected all the time. What do you?
I think that's one of the reasons parents can't get too mad about you being on your phone, because it allows you to do so many positive things, but there's also more of a worry there because it's not just sitting there watching TV for hours, but there's negative things that can happen, that you can be talking to people, you don't know who they are, but they can't say, don't be on your phone at all, because then they couldn't reach you as well.
Okay. Does anybody want to speculate on other things that might be leading to this depression that we're seeing? You mentioned a rising drug use. I had been reading a book about Japanese society that talked about other stresses in modern life. Are there others that you want to suggest for us, Don? Or not?
Yeah, I mean, it may just be that we do get less opportunities to interact with others face-to-face overall.
Okay.
There might be issues with perhaps even smaller families or family members being farther away from each other, so there's less contact with people you might have had even no choice but to have contact with.
Certainly there are many cultural things that are changing that have been documented for a number of years that are affecting everyone. Breakdown of family life, how many families actually eat dinner together and talk with one another over dinner, and so lots of things like that.
So we're down to our last few minutes here, and you each get just a little bit more to say here. Maybe we should offer some advice to parents or to teachers or to counselors. Is there a way we can equip ourselves to help the young adults we know navigate these risks better? What would you like to see us teachers and parents doing for you there, Taylor?
I think it's really important in the parents aspect when they have really young children to not just give them an iPad or give them a phone to make them stop crying or whatever, and let them become so dependent on it so early in their lives. I know there's parents out there that really limit children's screen time, and I think that really helps.
Is there anything we have to teach people about the technology?
Yeah, I would agree with Taylor that you have to start early, and I would tell parents to focus on the 3 C's. So look for children using devices like smartphones or tablets for doing creative things, for connecting with their social and physical environment, and for communicating with loved ones.
What do people in your profession have to do to make themselves ready to meet these challenges?
Become more aware of the apps that are available that are helpful.
Oh, okay. Helpful apps. Very good. Okay. And one more comment here. Are your classmates getting enough sleep? We were alarmed in this article with people sleeping on top of their smartphones. What do you think?
I think it's a big distraction. You could be laying there trying to go to sleep, and you see your phone light up and you're like, oh, well, got to get back up to check that. Don't know what it is, and it prolongs.
Good. Well, this is the advice I took from my reading. The author told us we should get our children a regular old alarm clock and put the smartphone far away from the bed. So thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News, and see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.